The girl. No one wanted to sit with the central cafeteria of Orion Trade Station was always busy during the evening cycle. Workers from many different worlds came there after long shifts to eat, rest, and talk with friends. The room was large and filled with dozens of tables. Bright lights hung from the ceiling, and the smell of many different alien foods mixed in the air. Humans were not very common on the station, but one human sat quietly at a small table near the wall. His name was Daniel Carter. Daniel was a single father raising his young daughter Lily while working as a mechanical technician on the station. Life was not easy, but he tried his best to give Lily a calm and normal childhood. That evening, they were eating a simple dinner together. Lily sat across from him, swinging her feet under the table while eating noodles from a small bowl. "Dad," she said happily, "tomorrow is my school project day." Daniel smiled while taking a sip of his drink. "I remember," he said. "You're building the solar system model." Lily nodded proudly. "I made Saturn twice as big because it looks cooler." Daniel chuckled quietly. Around them, the cafeteria was filled with many different alien species. Some had tall bodies and long arms. Others were short and covered with smooth scales. Conversations filled the room with many strange languages. But suddenly the cafeteria door slid open, and the noise slowly faded. A small alien girl stepped inside. She looked young, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Her skin was light silver with faint blue patterns running across her arms, and her eyes were large and glowing softly in the bright cafeteria lights. But the first thing people noticed was her leg. Her left leg was not natural. It was a thin metal support leg, carefully attached to her hip and designed to help her walk. Every step she took made a quiet click. Click. Click sound against the floor. The entire cafeteria watched her. Some aliens whispered quietly to each other. Others quickly looked away. The little girl paused near the entrance and looked around the room. There were many empty seats. But something strange happened. Whenever she slowly walked toward a table, the people sitting there suddenly became busy. Some moved their bags to the empty chairs. Others pretended not to see her. The girl stopped near one table where 2 tall reptilian aliens were eating. She spoke politely. Excuse me, may I sit here?" The 2 aliens looked at her metal leg. Then they looked at each other. One of them slowly slid his food tray into the empty chair. "Table full," he said coldly. The girl nodded quietly and walked away. Click, click, click. She tried another table. This time 3 traders sat there talking loudly. "May I share this table?" she asked softly. One of the traders barely looked at her. "No seats," he said while waving his hand dismissively. Again the girl nodded and moved on. Across the cafeteria, Lily watched everything carefully. "Dad," she whispered quietly, "why is no one letting her sit?" Daniel had noticed the same thing. He leaned back slightly in his chair and observed the room. The alien girl continued walking slowly between the tables. Each time she asked politely, or each time the answer was the same. No. Some people avoided eye contact. Others simply ignored her. The little girl tried to stay calm, but it was clear she was becoming nervous. Finally, she stopped in the center of the room. Her eyes moved across the cafeteria again. Then she noticed Daniel and Lily sitting at their small table. 2 empty chairs were still there. For a moment, she hesitated. Many people were watching now. Some aliens whispered to each other. One of them muttered quietly. "Vailari child," another voice whispered. "Trouble follows them." Daniel heard the whispers. He did not react, but he understood that the girl's species had some kind of reputation here. The little alien girl slowly walked toward Daniel's table. Click, click, click. The entire cafeteria seemed to grow quiet again. But Lily looked up at her with curiosity. The girl stopped beside the table. She looked at Daniel carefully. Her voice was soft and respectful. "Excuse me," she said. "Can I share this table?" For a moment, no one spoke. People across the cafeteria were watching. Some aliens expected the human to refuse like everyone else. Others looked worried about what might happen. Daniel looked at the girl for a few seconds. He noticed the metal leg. He noticed how tired she looked. And he noticed how carefully she stood, as if she expected to be rejected again. Daniel slowly pulled the empty chair away from the table. The sound of the chair sliding across the floor echoed slightly in the quiet cafeteria. Then he smiled gently. "Of course," he said. "You're welcome to sit here." The reaction in the room was immediate. Several aliens whispered louder now. One group looked shocked. Another group looked nervous. But the little alien girl simply blinked in surprise. For a moment, she seemed unsure if she had heard correctly. "Really?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "Really?" Lily quickly pushed a bowl of fruit toward the empty seat. "You can sit here," Lily said cheerfully. "My dad always says food tastes better when people eat together." The little alien girl slowly sat down. Her metal leg folded carefully beneath the chair. "Thank you," she said softly. "My name is Mira." Daniel smiled again. "I'm Daniel," he said, "and this is Lily." For the first time since entering the cafeteria, Mira looked relaxed. But across the room, several people continued watching the table. Some of them looked worried. Others looked uncomfortable. And one tall alien quietly whispered to his companion, "The human has no idea what he just did." Because somewhere on the station, there were people searching for the one-legged alien girl, and they were getting closer. The table everyone was watching. For a few moments after Mira sat down, the cafeteria stayed unusually quiet. Many people had stopped talking and were now pretending to eat while secretly watching Daniel's table. The room was still full of voices and movement, but the atmosphere had clearly changed. Mira noticed it too. Even though she tried to focus on the small bowl of fruit Lily had pushed toward her, she could feel the attention of the entire room. Daniel, however, behaved as if nothing strange was happening. He calmly continued eating his dinner and occasionally looked at Lily while she talked about school and her solar system project. His relaxed attitude slowly made the moment feel less tense. Mira carefully picked up a small piece of fruit and examined it with curiosity before taking a bite. Her eyes widened slightly. "This is sweet," she said softly. Lily smiled proudly. "My dad says fruit from Earth farms tastes the best." Daniel chuckled quietly. "I didn't say the best. I said the most reliable." Mira watched the father and daughter talking with each other. Something about their calm conversation made her feel a little safer. It had been a long time since she had sat at a table where people treated her normally. Still, she could not completely ignore the strange looks coming from other tables, as some aliens whispered behind their hands. Others glanced at Daniel as if he had made a dangerous decision. Daniel noticed those looks too. After a moment, he leaned forward slightly and spoke in a quiet voice. "You don't have to worry about them," he said calmly. "People on stations like this always stare when something unexpected happens." Mira lowered her eyes slightly. "They are not staring because it is unexpected," she replied softly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then why?" Mira hesitated. For a moment she seemed unsure if she should answer, but Lily was watching her with honest curiosity, not fear. Finally, Mira took a small breath and spoke. "My species is called the Violari," she explained quietly. "Many people believe Violari bring trouble." Daniel leaned back slightly, listening carefully. "And do you?" he asked. Mira shook her head quickly. "No," she said, "but trouble often finds us." Daniel noticed the careful way she chose her words. It sounded like something an adult might say, not a young child. That made him wonder what kind of life she had already experienced. Lily tilted her head curiously while looking at Mira's metal leg. "Does it hurt when you walk?" she asked gently. Mira looked down at the thin mechanical support attached to her hip. "Not anymore," she answered. "It took a long time to learn how to use it, but now it feels normal." Daniel studied the prosthetic carefully. It was not cheap equipment. The engineering looked advanced, far more sophisticated than the average station repair clinic could provide. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "My mother built it," Mira replied. Daniel looked surprised. Your mother is an engineer?" Mira nodded. "She was one of the best system technicians on our colony transport." The words "was" and "colony transport" immediately caught Daniel's attention. "What happened to the transport?" he asked quietly. Mira's small hands tightened slightly around the spoon she was holding. For a moment she did not answer. Then she spoke slowly. "Pirates attacked our ship." Lily stopped eating. Even several nearby tables became quieter when they heard that word. Pirates were common in some regions of space, especially around trade routes and colony transports carrying valuable cargo. Daniel's expression became serious. "Were you traveling to a new colony?" he asked. Mira nodded again. "There were many families on the ship. My mother said we were going somewhere peaceful where Vailari could live safely." Daniel waited for her to continue, but Mira looked down at her metal leg again. "The pirates wanted something," she said softly. "What?" Daniel asked. Mira lifted her eyes slowly. "Children." The word hung in the air between them. Lily frowned in confusion. "Why would pirates want children?" she asked. Mira looked uncomfortable. Daniel gently placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "Let her finish," he said calmly. Mira continued speaking in a quiet voice. "Vailari children are different," she explained. "Our species can sense and control energy systems more easily than most others. Adults can repair machines very quickly, but some children are born with stronger abilities." Daniel slowly understood what she meant. And children like that would be extremely valuable to certain groups in the galaxy. Corporations, criminal organizations, private research groups. Many people would pay enormous amounts of money for a living being who could interact with advanced technology naturally. "So the pirates were looking for Vailari children," Daniel said quietly. Mira nodded. "There were several of us on the ship." Daniel looked at her leg again. "And during the attack?" Mira finished the sentence for him. "I lost my leg while helping my little brother escape." The table became silent. Lily looked shocked. "You saved him?" she asked. Mira gave a small nod. "My mother helped us reach a rescue shuttle. Many people escaped before the pirates could stop us." Daniel studied the girl in front of him. Despite her calm voice, she had clearly been through something terrifying. Before Daniel could ask another question, the cafeteria door slid open again. This time, the room did not simply become quiet. It became tense. 3 large figures walked inside. They wore dark armor designed for space travel, and heavy boots echoed across the floor as they stepped forward. Their eyes scanned the room slowly. Daniel immediately recognized the look of professional hunters. The entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. The hunters continued walking forward, and then their eyes stopped on one table. Daniel's table. Mira's face suddenly turned pale. Her hands began to shake slightly. Daniel followed her gaze toward the approaching figures. The hunters had found exactly who they were searching for. And they were walking directly toward the human single father's table. The hunters in the cafeteria. The moment the 3 armored hunters stepped into the cafeteria, the atmosphere of the entire room changed. The quiet conversations that had slowly returned after Mira's story immediately stopped again. Many people lowered their voices or looked down at their food, pretending not to notice what was happening. Others watched nervously from the corners of their eyes. On a large station like Orion, bounty hunters were not uncommon, but their presence always meant trouble for someone. Daniel Carter saw them the same moment Mira did. The hunters were tall and heavily built. Their dark armor looked expensive and reinforced for combat environments, not just travel. Now their boots made heavy sounds against the cafeteria floor as they walked slowly between the tables. None of them looked like ordinary travelers. They moved with calm confidence, scanning the room carefully as if they already knew exactly who they were searching for. Daniel quietly placed his cup back on the table. Across from him, Mira had gone completely still. Her silver eyes were fixed on the approaching hunters, and her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Lily noticed the sudden change in her expression. "Mira?" Lily asked softly. Mira didn't answer. Daniel leaned slightly closer and spoke in a calm voice. "Those the pirates?" he asked quietly. Mira shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "Not pirates." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Hunters?" he guessed. Mira nodded once. That was enough information. And Daniel had seen people like them before in other stations and border colonies. They were professionals who captured targets and delivered them to whoever paid the highest price. Sometimes they hunted criminals, sometimes they hunted rare cargo, and sometimes they hunted people. The three hunters stopped near the center of the cafeteria and slowly looked around the room. One of them activated a small handheld scanner. A faint blue light swept across the tables and chairs as the device searched for something, or someone. Mira quietly lowered her head. Daniel noticed the movement. "Stay calm," he said quietly. Lily looked between them, confused. "Dad, what's happening?" she whispered. Daniel gave his daughter a reassuring look. "Nothing yet," he said calmly, but his eyes remained on the hunters. The scanner beeped softly. The hunter holding it looked down at the device and then turned his head slowly. His gaze stopped directly on Daniel's table. For a moment, the entire cafeteria seemed to freeze. The hunter gave a small nod to his companions. Then the three of them began walking forward. Several people quickly moved their chairs out of the way. Others lowered their heads and focused on their meals, clearly not wanting to become involved in whatever was about to happen. The hunters stopped beside Daniel's table. Up close, they looked even more intimidating. The leader removed his helmet, revealing a hard, scarred face with cold eyes that showed no kindness. He looked directly at Mira. "There you are," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed the situation was already finished. And Mira's breathing became faster, Daniel noticed. He leaned slightly back in his chair but did not move away. The hunter leader looked down at the table. "You have caused us a great deal of trouble, little Vailari," he continued. Mira said nothing. The hunter glanced at Daniel. His eyes briefly examined the human sitting calmly in the chair. "And you," he said, "are sitting in the wrong place at the wrong time." Daniel folded his hands calmly on the table. "That happens sometimes," he replied. One of the other hunters gave a short laugh. The leader ignored the comment and looked back at Mira. "Stand up," he ordered. Mira did not move. The hunter's expression hardened slightly. "I will say it one more time," he said slowly. "Stand up." Daniel gently placed his hand on the table between Mira and the hunters. "Wait, hold on," he said. The leader turned his head toward him. Daniel's voice was still calm. "You walked into a restaurant and started ordering a child around," he continued. "That seems a little rude." A few nearby tables quietly moved farther away. The hunter studied Daniel carefully now. "You are interfering," he said. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Looks like it." The second hunter leaned forward slightly, his armored gloves resting on the table. "This is none of your concern, human," he said. "The girl belongs to our employer." Daniel's eyes became colder. "No one belongs to anyone," he replied. The hunter leader sighed quietly, as if he had already expected this conversation to happen. Then he slowly reached down and placed a small metal restraint device on the table. "We are not here to argue," he said calmly. Then he looked directly at Mira again. "You will come with us." The entire cafeteria was silent. Dozens of people were watching now, but no one spoke. No one helped. No one stood up. Daniel looked at Mira. Her eyes were full of fear. She had already run from hunters before. She knew what would happen if they took her. Daniel leaned back slowly and pushed his chair away from the table. The sound of the chair sliding across the floor echoed across the quiet cafeteria. Then he stood up. The hunters looked at him with mild amusement. To them he looked like an ordinary civilian, a mechanic, a father, someone who would step aside once things became serious. Daniel looked down at the restraint device on the table. Then he pushed it gently back toward the hunter leader. "She asked to share this table," Daniel said calmly. "And as long as she's sitting here?" He met the hunter's eyes. "You're not taking her." The room went completely silent. Even the cafeteria machines seemed quieter. The hunters stared at the human standing in front of them. And for the first time since entering the room, they realized this situation might not be as simple as they expected. The human who refused to move. For a few seconds after Daniel Carter spoke those words, the entire cafeteria remained completely silent. The tension in the room was so thick that even the soft hum of the food machines seemed louder than before. People at nearby tables slowly stopped eating and turned their attention toward the confrontation. No one wanted to be involved, but no one could look away either. The three hunters stood beside the table, staring at Daniel with expressions that slowly changed from mild amusement to irritation. They were used to fear. Most civilians stepped aside the moment armed hunters appeared. That was how things normally worked in places like Orion Station. But the human standing in front of them was not stepping aside. Daniel remained calm. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were focused and alert. He stood between the hunters and the small alien girl without raising his voice or making dramatic movements. He simply refused to move. The hunter leader slowly leaned forward and placed both hands on the table. His armored gloves made a dull metal sound against the surface. "You misunderstand the situation," he said quietly. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Do I?" he replied. The hunter's eyes moved toward Mira again. "The Vailari child is extremely valuable," he continued. "Our employer has paid a great deal of money to locate her. We will take her now and leave peacefully." Daniel listened to every word. Then he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. The hunter leader blinked once in disbelief. "No," he repeated. Daniel gestured lightly toward the chair where Mira was still sitting. "She's eating dinner," he said. "You can come back later." A few people in the cafeteria almost laughed at the strange calmness of the answer, but no one actually made a sound. Everyone could feel the danger growing in the room. The second hunter stepped forward, his voice becoming less patient. "You are protecting property that does not belong to you," he said coldly. Daniel folded his arms. "She's a kid," he replied, "and not property." The hunters exchanged quick looks with each other. They were beginning to realize the human might actually fight them if necessary. That possibility annoyed them more than it worried them. The third hunter leaned down slightly, so his face was closer to Daniel's. "You are a civilian," he said quietly. "Three armed professionals stand in front of you. Think carefully before you continue." Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. "I already did." Behind Daniel, Lily had quietly moved closer to Mira. The two girls sat side by side, watching the adults carefully. Lily did not fully understand everything that was happening, but she could feel that the situation was dangerous. Mira's hands trembled slightly as she held the edge of the table. She whispered softly toward Daniel, "You should let them take me." Daniel heard her clearly. He glanced back at her. "Why?" he asked. Mira lowered her eyes. "Because they will hurt you." Daniel studied her for a moment. Then he gave a small smile. "Kid," he said gently, "you asked to sit at this table?" Mira nodded slowly. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Then you're sitting at my table." Across the room, several people exchanged surprised looks. No one expected the human to treat the situation so simply. But the hunters had reached the end of their patience. The leader straightened up slowly and picked up the restraint device from the table. His voice became colder. "You have made your position clear," he said. Then he looked directly at Mira. "Stand up!" Daniel did not move. The hunter activated the restraint device with a sharp click. A faint blue energy field appeared around the metal cuffs. Several people at nearby tables quietly moved away from the area. Daniel sighed. "You're really going to try this in the middle of a restaurant?" he asked. The hunter leader gave him a hard stare. "You had your chance to step aside." Daniel nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Then he reached down and gently pulled the chair away from the table again. The scraping sound echoed through the quiet room. But instead of stepping away, Daniel stepped forward. Now he stood directly between the hunters and the table. The leader frowned. "You're serious," he said. Daniel shrugged. "Pretty much." For a moment, everyone waited to see what would happen next. Then the second hunter suddenly reached for Daniel's shoulder, intending to shove him out of the way. And that was the moment everything changed. Daniel moved faster than anyone in the room expected. Before the hunter's hand even touched him, Daniel grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it sharply. The motion was smooth and controlled, like something practiced many times before. The hunter's arm locked in place, forcing him to bend forward to avoid breaking his own wrist. The cafeteria gasped. The hunter leader stepped back slightly in surprise. Daniel released the man and calmly stepped away again. "Don't touch me," he said. The hunters stared at him with new expressions now. Not amusement, not irritation, recognition. The leader studied Daniel's stance more carefully. "You've had training," he said slowly. Daniel didn't answer, but the silence itself was an answer. Across the cafeteria, people whispered to each other again. And the human was not just a civilian. The hunter leader narrowed his eyes. "Former military?" he guessed. Daniel finally spoke. "Used to fix things for the Terran Defense Fleet," he said. That answer made the hunters pause. Combat engineers in the Terran fleet were not ordinary mechanics. They were trained to survive in dangerous situations. The leader exhaled slowly. Then he gave a small smile. "That explains the confidence." He glanced at his two partners, then back at Daniel. "But 3 professionals still stand in front of you?" Daniel nodded. "I noticed." The hunter leader tilted his head slightly. "You cannot win this." Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he looked at Mira, then at Lily, then back at the hunters. "Maybe not," he said calmly. "But you're still not taking her." And at that moment, everyone in the cafeteria understood something important. The situation had passed the point of negotiation. The next thing that happened would not be a conversation. When the cafeteria became a battlefield, the moment Daniel Carter said those words, the air inside the cafeteria seemed to freeze. No one spoke. No one moved. Every person in the room understood that the situation had reached a point where talking would no longer solve anything. The 3 hunters stood across from the human father, their expressions now serious and focused. The quiet restaurant that had been full of casual conversation only minutes earlier had suddenly turned into a place where everyone expected something dangerous to happen. The hunter leader slowly placed the restraint device back onto the table, but this time his hand remained close to the weapon attached to his belt. His cold eyes studied Daniel carefully. What had started as a simple collection job had now become an unexpected confrontation with someone who clearly had training. You are making a very expensive mistake, the hunter leader said calmly. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced behind him at Mira and Lily sitting quietly at the table. Lily looked worried, but trusted her father completely. Mira, however, looked terrified. She had seen hunters like these before. She knew what they were capable of. Daniel gave the two girls a reassuring nod. "Stay behind me," he said softly. Then he looked back at the hunters. The hunter leader gave a small signal with his hand. That was enough. The second hunter suddenly moved forward, grabbing the edge of the table and trying to shove Daniel out of the way. At the same moment, the third hunter reached for his energy weapon, but Daniel had been watching them carefully. The instant the table was pushed toward him, Daniel kicked the lower frame of the table sideways. The heavy metal surface tipped sharply, knocking the hunter's balance off and forcing him to step backward. The tray of food slid across the table and crashed onto the floor, scattering fruit and noodles everywhere. Gasps echoed through the cafeteria. Before the second hunter could recover, Daniel grabbed a metal chair and swung it hard into the man's armored chest. The impact knocked the hunter backward into another table, sending plates and cups crashing to the floor. The third hunter managed to pull out his weapon, but Daniel moved quickly again. He kicked another chair across the floor, striking the hunter's legs and forcing him to stumble. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Several customers quickly ran toward the exits while others ducked behind tables for cover. The restaurant staff activated emergency alarms and red warning lights began flashing along the walls. The hunter leader growled in anger and lunged toward Daniel with a combat knife drawn from his belt. Daniel stepped back just in time to avoid the blade. The knife sliced through the air where his shoulder had been only a moment earlier. Daniel grabbed a nearby serving tray and slammed it against the hunter's arm. The metal tray bent under the force, but it was enough to knock the knife from the hunter's grip. The leader reacted instantly, throwing a punch toward Daniel's face. But Daniel blocked the strike and countered with a fast elbow that forced the hunter backward. For a brief moment, the two men stood facing each other in the middle of the destroyed cafeteria. The hunter leader wiped a small cut on his lip and smiled slightly. "You are better than I expected," he admitted. Daniel said nothing. Behind him, Mira watched the fight with wide eyes. She had never seen someone stand against hunters like this before. Most people ran or surrendered. But the human father in front of her refused to back down. Meanwhile, the second hunter recovered from the chair strike and charged forward again. This time he tried to tackle Daniel directly. Daniel stepped aside at the last second and grabbed the man's arm, using his momentum to slam him hard into the side of the food counter. The impact shook the metal structure and sent several containers falling to the floor. The third hunter had finally regained his weapon and raised it again. But before he could fire, a loud metallic sound echoed through the room. Daniel had kicked a heavy cooking pot across the floor. It struck the hunter's wrist and knocked the weapon from his hand. The gun slid across the floor until it disappeared under a table. Now all three hunters were breathing heavily, their armor scratched and their patience completely gone. Around them, the cafeteria looked like a battlefield. Tables were overturned, food was scattered across the floor, and frightened customers had moved far away from the fight. Daniel stood calmly in the center of the room, his breathing steady. The hunter leader looked around at the destruction and shook his head slowly. "But all of this," he said, "for a child that is not even yours." Daniel glanced briefly at Mira again. Then he looked back at the hunters. "She asked to sit at my table," he said. The leader sighed. "You humans," he muttered. At that moment, distant sirens echoed through the corridor outside the cafeteria. Station security was finally responding to the emergency alarms. The hunters heard the sirens too. The leader's expression darkened. "We don't have time for this," he said sharply. Then he looked at Mira one last time. "This is not over." Daniel stepped forward slightly. "Yes," he said calmly, "it is." The security doors of the cafeteria suddenly slid open, and armed station officers rushed inside. Within seconds, the hunters were surrounded. The fight was finally finished. But across the cafeteria, people were still staring at Daniel Carter. Because a simple human mechanic had just defeated 3 professional hunters to protect a little alien girl who only wanted a place to sit. The human. They underestimated. The sound of security sirens echoed through the corridors outside the cafeteria, growing louder with every passing second. Red emergency lights flashed along the walls, reflecting off the overturned tables and scattered food across the floor. The once busy dining hall now looked like the aftermath of a small battle. Plates were broken, chairs were lying on their sides, and frightened customers stood far away near the exits, watching everything carefully. In the center of the room stood Daniel Carter. His breathing was steady, and although his shirt had a small tear near the shoulder from the fight, he still looked calm and focused. In front of him, the 3 bounty hunters had slowly gathered themselves again. They were bruised and clearly frustrated, but none of them were willing to admit defeat so easily. The leader of the hunters looked toward the cafeteria entrance where the security sirens were coming from. His eyes narrowed slightly. He knew that once station security arrived in full force, escaping would become difficult. But he also knew that the prize they had come for was still sitting behind the human. Mira remained beside Lily at the table. Her silver eyes were wide with fear, but she also looked at Daniel with something new: hope. The human had already done more for her than anyone else on this station. The hunter leader slowly turned back toward Daniel. "Oh, you think this is finished because security is coming?" he said quietly. Daniel shrugged slightly. "It helps," he replied. The leader smiled faintly. "But not enough." Without warning, the 3rd hunter suddenly lunged forward again. He had retrieved a small hidden device from his armor belt. The device emitted a sharp pulse of energy that shot across the floor toward Daniel. The energy burst was designed to stun a target for several seconds, more than enough time to grab Mira and escape. But Daniel had been watching the hunters carefully. The moment he saw the device activate, he flipped one of the overturned tables toward the hunters. The thick metal tabletop absorbed most of the energy pulse, sending sparks across its surface. The burst still pushed Daniel backward a step, but it did not knock him down. The hunter leader cursed under his breath. The 3rd hunter tried to rush past Daniel toward the girls. That was the moment Daniel moved again. With quick reflexes, he grabbed the edge of the serving counter beside him and pulled a heavy metal tray rack forward. The rack crashed down directly in the hunter's path, forcing him to stop suddenly. Before the hunter could react, Daniel stepped forward and drove his shoulder into the man's armored chest. The impact sent the hunter crashing into a stack of food containers behind the counter. The 2nd hunter attempted to grab Daniel from behind, but Daniel twisted his body and struck the man's arm with a sharp elbow. The movement forced the hunter to release his grip. Now the leader himself stepped forward. This time there was no hesitation. He pulled out a compact shock baton from his belt. The weapon activated with a crackling sound as blue electricity ran along its surface. "You have made this much harder than it needed to be," the leader said coldly. Daniel gave a small smile. "Story of my life," he replied. The hunter swung the baton toward Daniel's side. Daniel blocked the strike using a metal serving tray, but the electric energy still traveled across the surface and forced him to drop it quickly. The leader attacked again, faster this time. The baton moved toward Daniel's shoulder, but Daniel stepped aside and grabbed the hunter's arm, twisting it sharply. For a moment, the 2 men struggled against each other in the center of the destroyed cafeteria. Then Daniel used the hunter's momentum against him, to turning his body and slamming the armored man directly into the cafeteria drink machine. The impact caused the machine to burst open, sending streams of liquid across the floor. The hunter staggered backward, stunned. At that exact moment, the cafeteria doors burst open. Armed Orion Station security officers rushed inside with weapons raised. "Everyone stop!" the lead officer shouted. The hunters froze. Within seconds, security officers surrounded them from all directions. Energy restraints were placed on their arms, and their weapons were confiscated quickly. The leader of the hunters glared at Daniel one last time as the officers forced him to his knees. "This is not over," he said quietly. Daniel simply nodded. "It is for tonight," he replied. And the officers dragged the hunters out of the cafeteria while several other security members began questioning witnesses. Slowly, the tension in the room began to fade. Restaurant workers started cleaning the mess while customers cautiously returned to their seats. But many people were still staring at Daniel. Word of what had just happened was already spreading through the station network. A single human father had stood up to 3 professional bounty hunters, not for money, not for glory, but because a frightened alien child had asked to sit at his table. Behind him, Mira slowly walked forward. She stopped beside Daniel and looked up at him. Her voice was soft. "You protected me," she said. Daniel looked down at her and smiled gently. "You were eating dinner," he said simply. And then Lily joined them and handed Mira another piece of fruit. "You can stay at our table any time," Lily said happily. Around them, several aliens who had refused Mira earlier now looked uncomfortable, because they had just witnessed something important. The human species had a reputation for being dangerous, but now they understood something else. Humans could also be dangerous for anyone who tried to harm a child, and the story of the human father in the cafeteria was only beginning to spread across Orion Station. The story everyone remembered. After the station security officers removed the hunters from the cafeteria, the room slowly began to return to normal. Workers from the restaurant started cleaning the overturned tables and broken dishes, while customers who had rushed to the exits cautiously came back inside. The emergency lights stopped flashing, and the loud alarms faded away, leaving only the quiet sound of people talking again. But the atmosphere of the cafeteria was no longer the same as before. Everyone had seen what happened. They had seen 3 professional bounty hunters enter the room with complete confidence. They had seen the fear in the small alien girl's eyes when the hunters approached her. And most importantly, they had seen a single human father stand up and refuse to let them take her away. Daniel Carter quietly moved one of the fallen chairs back into place and sat down again at the table as if nothing unusual had happened. He looked a little tired, and his sleeve had a small tear from the fight, but otherwise he seemed calm. For him, the situation had simply been something that needed to be handled. Across the table, Lily smiled brightly. "Dad," she said proudly, "that was awesome." Daniel gave her a small look. "We don't say awesome when people break the furniture," he replied calmly. Lily giggled. Meanwhile, Mira stood quietly beside the table. She still looked slightly shaken from everything that had happened, but the fear that had been in her eyes earlier was slowly disappearing. For the first time since she had entered the cafeteria, she no longer felt alone. Several aliens nearby watched the table carefully. These were the same people who had refused to let Mira sit earlier. Now they looked uncomfortable and embarrassed. One tall trader slowly walked over and cleared his throat. "I may have misjudged the situation earlier," he said awkwardly. Mira looked at him but said nothing, and the trader shifted nervously before returning to his table. Daniel noticed the exchange but did not comment on it. Instead, he calmly pushed Mira's bowl of fruit a little closer to her. "You didn't finish eating," he said. Mira looked down at the bowl and gave a small smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. A few minutes later, 2 station security officers approached the table. Their expressions were serious but respectful. "Mr. Carter?" one of them asked. Daniel looked up. "That's me." The officer nodded. "We reviewed the security recordings," he explained. "Those hunters were carrying illegal capture equipment and false authorization codes. They have been wanted by several systems." Daniel nodded slightly. "So I guessed correctly," he said. The officer gave a small smile. You did more than guess correctly, he replied. You prevented a kidnapping. Several people nearby listened carefully to that sentence. The officer continued speaking. The station administration would like to thank you for your actions. Daniel waved his hand lightly. It wasn't a big deal, he said. But many people in the cafeteria disagreed with that. To them, it had been a very big deal. After the officers left, Mira slowly looked up at Daniel again. Why did you help me? She asked. The question was simple, but it carried a lot of meaning. Daniel thought about it for a moment before answering. Then he shrugged slightly. You asked if you could sit here, he said. Mira blinked. That's it? She asked. Daniel nodded. That's it. Lily leaned forward with a grin. My dad says that if someone asks nicely, you should always help them. Mira looked at both of them. And then something small but important happened. She laughed. It was a quiet laugh, but it was the first real laugh she had made since entering the cafeteria. The tension around the table faded. Soon the three of them finished their meal together. When Mira finally stood up to leave, Daniel noticed her metal leg again. The quiet clicking sound echoed softly across the floor as she walked. But this time the cafeteria felt different. People were no longer staring at her with fear. Many of them nodded politely as she passed. The story of what had happened spread quickly across Orion Station. Workers talked about it in maintenance corridors. Traders repeated it in cargo bays. Even security officers mentioned it during their shifts. The story was simple. A one-legged alien girl had walked into a crowded cafeteria looking for a place to sit. No one wanted her at their table, except one human. And when danger followed her into the room, that human stood up and refused to move. For Mira, however, the story was even simpler. She had asked a question. Can I share this table? And the human single dad had answered in a way she would never forget. Yes.